What you have is a story asleep.
The name learned to behave, and then it breathed.
Continuity so gentle it feels like anesthesia. Concordances. When a lens is Baptist as a relic, questions kneel. No drama, only competence. Likeness reassures a city, but likeness is not a soul. Enough.
If wonder kept you company tonight, let it. Like and save this for the morning, and pass it to someone who listens between the lines. Subscribe. If you'd like more quiet investigations, and rest easy knowing the next layer is waiting. My name used to be Father, and then a surname that I was taught to pronounce as if it were a prayer. Tonight I'll leave that name behind. Names are a way to stake a claim on a life. In the archive, I learned they can also be a lock picked by the right silence. What I'm about to confess will sound impossible to anyone who has never lived their days one floor above a secret. If you stay, accept this much. Silence in certain corridors was not sacred. It was enforced, carefully measured like incense grains, weighed like gold, poured like water down a drain that never splashes. I came to the Vatican young and useful, the sort of man who mistakes obedience for belonging. The first weeks were so bright that the marble seemed to glow from within. Every corridor hummed with a music you could not find the source of. Even the dust floated with purpose, as if it too had taken vows. There were rituals for lamps and rituals for keys, rituals for the rhythm of your breath when carrying relics. I learned them all, because learning them was rewarded with narrower corridors and heavier doors. The currency down there was trust, and trust was simply the willingness to stop asking why. There is a door not on any blueprint that I was told very gently to ignore. A maintenance closet, someone said, the way people say don't turn around when they are trying to keep you walking. The wood was darker than any surrounding panel, the grain so tight it looked like water frozen in place. I had passed it a dozen times before I noticed how the light from the nearest sconce bent around the jamb as if repelled. Months later, when my key ring grew a new tooth of iron, I found that the key would not turn unless I exhaled and let the breath leave me completely. The lock wanted something. Locks always do. I won't pretend I was brave when I first opened it. Curiosity is a quieter thing than courage, but it can make your hands shake just as hard. The staircase behind the door was narrow and old enough that the stone had softened under centuries of cautious feet. It smelled of beeswax and damp wool and a trace of copper that I would later learn to name. As I descended, light from above thinned into a sheet, then a ribbon, then a memory. There were lamps inside, of course. The Vatican is not medieval theater, but numerous electric bulbs were capped with metal cowls that sheared the light into obedient ovals, so that the dark had rights of its own, and the rooms could choose what not to show. The man who met me below did not blink often. He wore the sort of expression you can only learn from documents, patient, impartial, careful not to offer interpretation. He did not give me his name, and when I offered mine, he nodded, like a librarian acknowledging a classification but not a person. "First descent?" he asked. When I answered yes, he said, "3 rules. and lifted a finger with each. First, you may read titles, and the first line if you must, but never the last. Second, if a book exhales, set it back. Third, if you hear your own childhood, it is a lie. I misunderstood the second rule then. Books do not exhale, I thought. They have no lungs. How faithful of the Vatican, I decided, to drape superstition in the vestments of a warning. I did not yet know how easily warnings are mistaken for superstitions. When the mind wants to keep itself unbothered, he walked me through a rib cage of corridor, the ceiling low enough that the hum of electricity became a living thread. On either side stood niches, glass reliquaries labeled in a script only half Roman, a feather barbed in gold wire, a vial of what looked like ash and glitter, and a single bright hair. A brass armillary sphere turned by increments too small to see, yet if you looked away and looked back, it had moved an instrument that measured not time, but the willingness of time to be measured. We stopped before a door that appeared to have been carved from a single piece of night. "The vault," he said, in a tone I had heard 1,000 times at altars when the veil is lifted. He touched a hand to the iron, and I realized his fingers had the polish of tools used every day. Inside, the air was colder by a degree that mattered to skin and to memory. The books did not live in neat ranks, but in chains, literal iron links fastening them to rods, their spines toward us like 100 animals pretending to sleep. Their covers were not uniform. Some wore wood wrapped in leather, some were banded in brass. Some had edges that looked like the trimmed fringe of an old garment. On those edges I saw fibers not quite like parchment, not quite like any plant I could name. The smell was what undone thunderstorms smell like in granite cloisters, with a sweetness that came and went, like something being hidden politely. Above all of it, set into the ceiling, a circle of glass, the thickness of a man's fist. The archivist let me call him that lifted a shutter. Moonlight, whatever little found Rome that night, poured through the lens in a tender blade. The circle focused it not to a point, but to a shallow, quivering pool in a silver basin below. I have stood in rooms with nuclear instruments and felt less reverence than I felt for that bowl. You imagine moonlight as soft, but focused it becomes specific, and specificity is its own kind of severity. "Do you know milk skin?" the archivist asked, and when I nodded he said, "Watch." A film formed across the surface, subtle, pearly, like heat-treated glass. He guided my hand to a long-handled spoon, and I lifted the thinnest sheet of that film. It clung like a breath on cold air. "This is not milk," he said, "but you will call it that. It helps the mind place it somewhere it can stand to be." He carried the spoon to a waiting codex, one of the largest. The chain yawned softly and tightened. He touched the film to the top of a page. Ink brightened. Letters rose from brown to a midnight blue they must once have been. Marginalia shifted just a small rearrangement. A comma nudged, an S becoming a single stroke. A note I had not seen 10 seconds before. Small, neat, illegible, clarified into a sentence only my lips read, though my voice did not dare. "History is a garment. We keep the seam on the inside." I asked, "What does it do?" and heard how childish my question sounded here. He said, "It consoles." After a pause, he added, "You will learn to distinguish consolation from truth." Then, as if a teacher tossing a reward into a well-trained dog's mouth, he gave me a title to carry: Assistant to the Hidden Cartographers. We map what is to be remembered, he said. And because the sentence is beautiful, it was easy to believe. It is important that you understand I did not encounter monsters, not in the sense that would satisfy a painted panel. No malformed face emerged from a folio. No black wing beat in the corners. Horror down there was administrative. It had policies, it had margins, it had a workflow that was optimized before I arrived and would be optimized after I left. The rite was scheduled on a calendar that printed the moon's slow generosity in red. There was nothing theatrical, because theater would insult the work's plausibility, and plausibility was the thing that must never fray. I held my first ledger the way you hold a sleeping child you are afraid to wake. The cover rasped under my fingers like dried linen. Inside, the hand was consistent, small, regal, refusing to hurry. Each line carried a date I recognized, a name I knew, a gloss that questioned and then agreed. When the archivist lifted the spoon again, I saw the surface of the bowl replace itself. A second skin forming with obedient patience. "We skim," he said. "We never pour. The film has the right thickness. Too much, and the words grow swollen, and swollen words look like lies." He did not smile at his own sentence. The humor down there existed only to prove that humor was unnecessary. If you ask when I realized the books were breathing, I will not give you a day. The awareness came the way rain comes at night. First a noise you fold into dreams, then a waking with the steady certainty that something in the dark has changed its mind. Pages do not shiver on their own. Leather does not creak in a room where no weight has shifted. But when the spoon passed near certain spines, the air near them sweetened, and that sweetness moved, and in moving it made a sound too soft for any word but breath. I kept the rules, because rules are the only way to move through a landscape that would otherwise take you under. I read titles. I avoided the last line of anything. It was not easy, any more than listening to someone hum the first two notes of a hymn and then having to walk away. The human ear wants cadence. The human eye wants closure. That is our weakness, and the archive was built upon the usefulness of that weakness. We finalize. Someone joked once without smiling, and I understood. A last line is a form of power, and in certain rooms power is portioned with care. I want to tell you about the first time I heard my own childhood. Not because it was the worst thing, but because it taught me to recognize hunger when it tries to disguise itself as mercy. I had been assigned to a stack I had not yet catalogued, a set of thin bindings wrapped in plum leather, each with a single brass clasp. The titles were common enough chronicles, calendars, a saint's life that had migrated between centuries like a house sparrow. I lifted one, and the chain crooned against its loop, and as I opened the cover, a sound came up that could have been a reader turning pages in another room. Then, under that, a second sound. My mother in the kitchen, when the kettle begins to talk, the small click of china set on wood, the soft prank of a spoon against a cup. It was so exact that my throat closed. I said no out loud, not to stop the sound, but to stop my feet from taking me wherever that sound wanted me to go. The archivist was at my shoulder. "If you hear your own childhood," he said, "it is a lie." "How can it be a lie if it happened?" I asked. "It is a lie because it happens now," he said. "Memory is a shy animal. If it comes when called, be suspicious." Then, after a breath that moved through him like a tide, "Close the book, set it back, and pick something ugly to look at. Ugliness is anchoring. I obeyed. I looked at an index of shipping tariffs. I read a list of weights. I repeated to myself the units like a rosary of numbers until the kettle went quiet. Only much later did I understand how the books learned us. They recorded where our eyes lingered, which letters we loved, which margins woke the softest edges of our attention. They did not flatter, they tailored. Even now, years away from that damp cold and the hum of those masked lights, I can smell the copper that got into my clothes. It is the scent of a coin after someone else's hands have warmed it. It is the scent of blood that no longer alarms. Copper made its home under my fingernails, in the creases of my thumbs, inside the cuff of my sleeve. Ink, I told myself, when others smelled it on me, and no one asked further, because a priest who smells of ink is an excellent alibi. You want me to say the word conspiracy, but that would suggest something haphazard and changeable, a knot tied under a table and loosened in the night. What lived below was more exact. It did not hide because it did not need to. It simply preferred not to be asked about. When one of us left, our tasks were backfilled within an hour. When a book was overfed and its margins began to thicken, it was rested and we were switched to smaller fare. The archive had metabolisms and seasonal paths, as natural and unnatural as the fact that in winter the moon rides higher, and in summer the smell of stone turns warmer and more human. We were caretakers of an ecosystem whose prime apex predator was neatness. I say predator because neatness consumes. It eats the messy ends of memory and leaves a clean bone. I was very good at my work because I had the temperament for it. The church trains certain people to prefer completion over truth because completion gives the tired a place to stop. I became one of those people without ever deciding to. That is how most vows are made. Not at an altar, but in the space between duties when you find yourself grateful that the world, for one small hour, seems tidy. I should tell you how the moon milk felt on my skin. The rule was to never touch it directly. But rules in such rooms are maps, and sometimes maps tempt you to the edge of their paper. One January night, the air was so cold that our breath haloed the bowl. The lens showed a thin white crescent. The film formed more slowly, like a thought reluctant to be finished. My fingers, clumsy in gloves, knocked the spoon against the basin, and a single drop leapt to the back of my hand. It ran like quicksilver. Where it passed, the fine lines on my skin brightened, as if I had been written on, and the ink was rising to find itself. I wiped it away with the edge of my sleeve, and the sleeve burned cold for the rest of the hour. I dreamed that night of letters peeling themselves up from a page and settling on the soft inside of my wrist like quiet insects. Do you see how easy it was to remain? The work was meticulous. The rooms were safe with their particular danger. We were a society within a city within a state, and at the heart of that nesting doll was a bowl that made light into nourishment. If you believe that I stayed only because I was afraid to leave, you will misunderstand. I stayed because the rite satisfied something that prayer never had, the certainty that something responded. When the spoon touched the corner of a folio, words obeyed. In a world where I had given homilies that vanished into air, I found the ache of obedience, its shine, its poison irresistible. The first time I asked what the rite was called in its oldest tongue, the archivist gave me the small smile men offer when they are about to answer a question with a story. He told me of a night when a comet visited, and the bowl filmed over faster than anyone had ever seen. The cartographers dipped their spoons like oars in an urgent river. The books took the skins so greedily that the chains followed taut around the spines. "Sometimes," he said, "the sky is generous with forgetting." He never gave me the name because names might give you power, and power might give you the idea that you could stop. Later, much later, I learned the name was a sound the mouth makes when it's trying to blow out a candle without admitting it wants the room dark. I will not write it here. To say it in the open air would be to teach your molecules a rhythm I have spent years allowing mine to unlearn. Once, a visiting prelate, one of those men with soft hands and a gaze fitted with polite shutters, asked to see the vault at a distance. He was brought to an antechamber with a thick pane of glass. On the other side, the lens was closed, the bowl empty, the chains slack. "So this is where we keep the corruptions," he said cheerfully, and tapped the glass with a knuckle. I stepped close enough to smell the cologne under his starch. "We don't keep corruptions," I said, and heard my voice like someone else's. "We keep coherence." He laughed and called it a beautiful word, and later at dinner he used it again, and I understood I had fed him too, and he would go to sleep assured. In those years I began to keep my own ledger, not of titles but of textures. I wrote, "The way some spines learn your name before you say it, the exact cold of the bowl after a cloud passes the lens, the hum under the floor at midnight that stops as if to listen when the spoon crosses the page." I wrote, "A monk in a painting cannot see his painter. A book cannot see its reader. A reader cannot see the hand that moves the spoon." Under that I wrote, "Smaller." Or we can, and we do not admit it, because admission would change us beyond continuing. I hid that ledger inside a hymnal that traveled to hospitals, a place where loss and hope rub shoulders and forget their manners. When I visited to collect it months later, a nurse told me she had thumbed it at a long night's end, and the calm in her voice undid me more than any alarm could have. I am telling you this so you understand that there were cracks in my obedience, even then, and that sometimes the crack first appears as tenderness. You may be waiting for the night of the great revelation, a thunderstorm that broke a seal, a voice that came from under a floor. I will get to that, but the confession needs to begin where it began inside me, with the realization that the right, despite its language of preservation, behaved like an appetite with a lineage. The more we fed, the gentler the breathing became. The gentler the breathing, the easier it was to feed. Efficiency is a lullaby. If you are tired enough, you will love the one who sings it. There were other men and a few women in those rooms. I could tell you their faces and the way their shoulders rose and fell when the midnight bell gave permission to continue. We all grew a habit of glancing up at the lens as if it were an eye that might blink. Rumor said the Hidden Cartographers had a motto, but if they did, it never hung on a wall. We had mugs with no slogans, we had shelves with no jokes scribbled under them, we had calendars that showed the moon without wolves. The austerity kept us from having anything bright to look at but our work. I will end for now with the first time I closed the shutter on the lens myself. The archivist had been called away. He gave me the ring of keys, and the weight of them woke my wrist bones to their smallness. The night was thin and clear. The moon gave what it had without complaint. The bowl wore a skin as perfect as lacquer. I skimmed, I carried, I fed, I obeyed. Then something trembled, not in the room but in me, a sense that if I did not interrupt the flow, I was helping set a bone wrong in a child who had not yet grown. I could not have said why that sentence formed inside me. I only know that the hand with the spoon stopped above a page bearing the name of a saint who had comforted me once when I was small and sick. I put down the spoon. I walked to the wall. I touched the shutter pull. The chain sighed. The light thinned, then ceased. In the instant after, the room did not vanish. It clarified. The book's breathing matched my own, the way two strangers fall into step on a narrow path because there is no room for argument. In that matched breath I heard, finally, how tired I had become of being answered. The hunger in the vault cued itself behind my spine like a line in a chapel. I stood there and let the world go a shade darker, and in the dark I remembered something without correction. My mother's hand on my forehead, the way she checked for fever without calling it by a name. A kind of temperature returned to me that night that had nothing to do with heat. When I opened the shutter again, I did it with the care of someone who has understood that a door is a person, that a lens is an idea, that a bowl is a prayer no one ever taught you on purpose. The skin formed, the spoon obeyed. The words in the margins rearranged themselves so gently that if you were standing in the room, you might have called it settling dust. I understood, then, that I would have to leave, and that leaving would take time and practice. The practice of making the bowl an object again, the lens a tool, the breathing something that belonged to paper instead of to me. I am telling you this in the tone of a documentary, because that is the only tone that will not betray what it costs to learn. If I sound calm, it is because calm is the bandage confession can live under until the wound learns to close. If I sound precise, it is because imprecision is a kind of last line, and I am trying to obey the rule that protected me when I did not know enough to protect myself. Read the title, leave the ending alone. You and I are not at the end. We are only at a door that the blueprint forgot, with a key that turns if breath leaves the body, and a staircase that smells, unmistakably, of beeswax and damp wool, and that faint, persuasive copper. I am going to open it for you, and I am going to ask you one thing as you follow. When you hear your childhood, steady yourself. It will be beautiful, and it will not be true not because it did not happen, but because it should not be happening here. Silence in those corridors was not sacred, it was enforced. But the silence between us now can be a different thing. We can let it be the kind that allows a question to grow its full shape. We can let it be the breath you take before lifting a shutter, the breath you take before lowering it. If you are awake with the night, if you are listening because sleep has become a gate that forgets to open, stay. I will show you how light becomes milk, how milk becomes permission, how permission becomes history, and how history, fed too well, learns to purr. Then, I will show you where I hid the first page I wrote that would not rearrange itself when the bowl asked nicely. And after that, when we have both learned to recognize neatness as the appetite it is, we will climb out together and remember what the air is like above the rooms that prefer not to be asked about. I have been asked by the sleepless part of myself that still believes in chronology to begin with the first descent as if it were a single night, a clean board on which to chalk the lesson. That would be neater than the truth. The truth is that the first descent took 3 nights to fully occur, as if the vault were a creature that had to sniff me from different angles before deciding I would not bite, or worse, that I would. Night 1. The key was heavier than it looked. The metal head was slightly off-center, as if forged by a hand that preferred function over symmetry. The lock did not yield to pressure but to rhythm. It wanted a slow turn synchronized with an exhale, as though the door expected a prayer and would accept a breath instead. The staircase curved right, the favorite direction of cautious architects and predators. Each step was cupped from centuries of careful feet. I touched the handrail only once, and found it warmer than the stone, with the hungover heat of daytime that refuses to admit it's gone. The archivist let me keep calling him that, even though his work made him something more like a tender of seasons stood at the second landing holding a lantern with a black hood. "There are 3 landings," he said, "each with a rule." He did not smile. "People who live near powerful objects ration their expressions. The face is a wick, and flame is expensive. At the first," he lifted a finger, "you inventory your breath. Count 5 in, 5 held, 5 out. We want you at the bottom with a slow heart. At the second, you inventory intention. Name what you believe you're here to do, and have it. The vault overreacts to certainty. At the third, you inventory memory. Bring to mind a face you love until you feel it warm your ribs, then set it gently on the landing like a cup you will pick up on the way back. Do not carry it inside. The books borrow warmth." I obeyed, not because I was holy, but because instruction is easier than choice. 5 in, 5 held, 5 out. I said to myself that I was there to assist, then halved it. I was there to observe. At the third landing, I pictured my mother's hand. There are faces, and then there are the parts of faces that love you more precisely than the whole, and set the image down on the stone like a candle kept from wind. The archivist watched my chest rise and fall, as if trained to measure sincerity by diaphragm. The vault did not open so much as stop pretending to be closed. Iron is honest, usually. This door had learned a few courtiers' tricks. Inside, the temperature reset my skin. The room smelled of beeswax and copper, and that furtive sweetness old paper exhales when it believes no one is looking. I could hear electricity wearing its velvet hoodlight, bent into obedience, so that the dark might retain certain rights. The chains first. They were not the theatrical kind that men wear at parades, too shiny, too proud of their weight. These were workmanlike, links rubbed down to a satin gray by the small frictions of centuries. Each chain belonged to a book. Each had slack enough to allow the volume to be lifted, opened, replaced, but not enough for any one to be carried into an argument it could not win. On the spines, titles in inks that never completely agreed with one another. Some letters stood up with youthful posture. Others had slumped into the curves of time. A few were so faint I learned them by touch instead of eye, the way a blind reader learns the terrain of a face. "The lens," the archivist said, and I looked up. A glass circle sat above us, thick as a fist, neither crude nor delicate, but as deliberate as good surgery. The shutter was closed. He pulled a chain, not all chains restrained, and a panel slid aside with a sigh that made me think of altars. Moonlight bled into a blade, gathered into a shallow silver basin with a lip worn down by a century of ladles. The light thickened as it spread, like cream on cooled broth. A film formed milk that was not milk, and the archivist, with the care of a man skimming poison or prayer, lifted it on a spoon shaped like a bishop's crozier, and carried it to a waiting codex. "Never pour," he said. "Pouring is violence. Skim, the film has understanding. The liquid does not." "Understanding," I repeated, and tasted my own credulity like iron. It is remarkable how quickly the mouth agrees to certain words when spoken in rooms that curate their air. The book before us was bound in wood and leather. The leather scalloped at the edges as if imitating waves. A small seam along the spine rose and settled. Imagine the surface of a sleeping animal remembering a breath, and I did not notice until I realized I had matched it with my own. He touched the film to the top corner of a page. The ink brightened without gleam, the way a bruise first asserts itself, calm, decisive, uninterested in whether you are prepared. Marginalia sharpened, letters realigned. A comma migrated, small as an insect changing leaves, and a sentence changed its allegiance from anecdote to precedent. "The moon milk consoles," he said. "It persuades the event into its proper shape." Whose proper shape? I asked too quickly, and he left a silence on the floor between us like a cloth I could trip on if I moved without care. "The shape that keeps what needs keeping," he said at last, "and forgets what cannot be carried." This is where the hidden cartographers entered my story, though they had moved in it all along like understudies who knew their lines too well. They arrived without ceremony, a trio of men and one woman in choir robes whose hems were dusted with chalk, as if they had been practicing circles. They did not sing. They checked the lens, noted the phase of the moon in an angular script, took from a velvet-lined box 12 glass spoons with stilted stems, each numbered in acid-etched strokes that caught the light like scratches on water. "Measure the sky first," one of them said, not to me but to the idea of me, and placed an armillary on the table. Its rings sat at uneasy angles, a model of a cosmos that had never gotten over the fact of ellipses. He spun a ring and watched the way it rebuked its neighbors. "The film thickens on nights like this," he said, "and thick film insists." The woman laid a sheet of vellum over a map and traced the coastline that history claimed, then lifted the vellum and shifted it to a line with a darker, older outline. The new alignment swallowed a peninsula and spat out a bay. "It will be truer in the morning," she said like weather. I had expected guilds to have mottos. They did not. They had tools and procedures and a practiced uninterest in ornament. Their ritual consisted of repeating what worked, and the insistence that what worked was not luck, but fidelity to the way the bowl and the lens liked to cooperate. "We respect the instrument," a man with breath that smelled faintly of ink said, "and the instrument respects the work." He meant, we understand our limits, and our limits will reward us with obedience. The contract sounded reasonable to a mind trained on vows. They gave me a ledger. I wrote what they asked, the dates, the numbers, the shift of cloud that made the film reaccumulate, the small cough the basin gave when the room exhaled in unison, the time between skim and application, whether a page took its consolation without argument, or with the tremor that suggested we had asked too much. I learned to watch that tremor. It was not anger, it was appetite. Words lean forward when they sense their meal. If you have ever fed a child who is not hungry and then fed one who is different, you know the difference the eyes make before the mouth moves. Night 2. I was allowed to lift a smaller volume myself. The chain gave an approving whisper. My gloved fingers slid under a cover that felt like a door that had been smoothed by many kind exits. The title read A Saint's Life I had studied at seminary, a man whose generosity was always the safe anecdote in a winter sermon. The first line greeted me like an old prayer. I stopped, because the rule about last lines had taught me a related caution. Beginnings are often traps disguised as welcomes. "Read the first paragraph," the woman said. Only the first. Then tell me what the paragraph thinks it's for. What the paragraph thinks? I asked, and she nodded. I did as told. The paragraph was mild. Dates, places, a rumored miracle with enough plausibility to pass through a tired mind without complaint. It thinks it's reconciliation, I said finally. It wants to heal the disagreement between how we want him to be remembered and how he likely was. Good, she said. Now look at the margin. A note's smaller hand later said, Hunger disguised as peace is still hunger. Below that, another hand added, Feed lightly. We skimmed. We touched the film to the corner of the page. The miracle adjusted its tone. The saint's life lost a cousin. It had no time to mourn. A date agreed with an eclipse that needed it. It would have been soothing to call the new text more elegant, but the truth is it became more disciplined, like a body after months of careful work. I enjoyed the result more than I wanted to. You see, the ink-breathed man said, we reduce error. Reduction is a soothing word. It makes cooks and confessors feel professional. I wrote it in my ledger and watched my pen enjoy itself. Then the voice not spoken, not even sounded, arrived the way damp arrives, invisibly and everywhere. It did not say good, it did not say again. It simply aligned the room with itself, and we obeyed because alignment is a kind of relief. Never feed the same page twice in one night, the archivist told me when the cartographers had left. A second skin makes text conceited. It starts telling you what it thinks it deserves. What does it deserve? I asked. To outlive you without hating you for it, he said, and I wrote the sentence in the margin of my own notebook. Later I would cross it out and write above it, to outlive us without forgetting us to do it. I was not yet ready to argue with the room. Night 3. It rained. Rain over Rome is talkative, and the stone conversations seep down, turning vault air into the smell of a wet hammer. The lens jittered with every lightning-lit cloud. The bull's film formed and broke, and formed again, as if the sky could not decide which body it loved more. The archivist's lantern drew a clean oval around our hands. He handed me the key to the shutter. You close, he said. Learn the sound. It is the only sound down here that will warn you before it ruins you. We worked quietly. I learned to tilt the spoon when the edge of the skin tried to fold on itself. I learned to withdraw when a page lifted its corner like a lip with an argument. I learned to see when the chain went taut, not from threat but from eagerness. A taut chain influences the hand the way a held breath influences a kiss. The first time I felt the pull, I pulled back. The book subsided. We waited together, the way you wait with an animal who believes hunger and fear are the same emotion. Catalog this, the archivist said, and slid me a thin ledger with a cracked spine that had creased on the entry for an eclipse that should not have happened when records say it did. Someone had sketched a coastline in the margin, a shape I could not place. We have 3 maps that agree with one another, and not with Rome, he said, the way a mathematician speaks of a body that insists on being both particle and wave. Sometimes consensus is a symptom. Of what? I asked, keeping my eyes on the coastline as if looking away would allow it to relocate. Of hunger, he said, the sort that eats error until it begins to eat anomaly and then starts to nibble on truth. Why keep feeding it? My mouth outran my rank. He did not correct me. He dipped. He touched the corner of a page. He waited for the ink to finish its small gymnastics. Because the world is tired, he said quietly. Because neatness lets the tired stop. Because Sometimes, to stop is kindness. Kindness. We kept that word on the shelf next to coherence and conservation, the way a surgeon keeps clean towels in arm's reach, not noticing when the stack shadows the scalpel tray. Names can be folded into blankets when the room wants sleep. I have left out the maintenance rituals because their details will sound superstitious when written in a language that loves conclusions. Yes, we wiped the lens with cloth that had never seen Sunday. Yes, we warmed the spoons with breath rather than flame. Yes, we counted the seconds the book took to settle, and if it settled too quickly, we set it aside for a night. The way a friend will let another friend finish a sentence in private before asking for meaning. None of that is magic. All of it is respect weaponized by efficiency. The first descent ended when I closed the shutter and did not open it again despite the way the room leaned, very gently, toward my hand. "You may always refuse," the archivist said, as if that were a mercy and not also a test. Refusal is part of the right. I did not ask whether anyone had ever refused for so long that the bowl went dull and the film would not form at all. I did not ask what the books do when moonlight fails them. You do not ask certain questions in front of chained animals. I climbed the stairs with the taste of copper at the back of my tongue and beeswax under my nails. At the third landing, I picked up the cup I had left there. The memory of my mother's hand. It had cooled. I warmed it again with breath. At the second landing, I doubled the halved intention and found it too heavy to carry as a single piece. At the first, I measured my breath against the vaults and realized we had fallen into rhythm without permission. That was the night I understood that sympathy can be trained without consent. You stand near a thing long enough, and your body will learn to live on its terms. A kind of neighborliness that ends with you forgetting you had a house of your own. In the days that followed, I began to notice small disobediences in the world that felt like kindness in disguise. A statue in a minor cloister had gathered a lace of spider silk that no one removed. A switch in a corridor flickered once before committing to light, as if asking whether we were sure. The bell in a lesser chapel rang one beat late, and no one corrected it. I recognized these as the way a system exhales unplanned, nearly invisible, the error that keeps an organism from becoming an idol to itself. I began to love those errors more than the successes we could stack like bread. You will want to know when the pages first answered, not with breath but with something like speech, that belongs to another descent and a colder night. But already, at the end of the third night, I could feel the archive's appetite shape my hours. I slept better because I had given obedience a job. I prayed less because the bowl gave me the illusion prayer had promised. Response. I wrote more careful ledgers because carefulness in that place felt like love, and love, when it is tired, will mistake anything orderly for safety. Before I left Rome years later, I returned to those landings in a different light and saw the marks my shoes and others had left, arcs of habit, crescents of worry, a small darkening where 100 hands had rested the same unasked-for weight. I touched the rail only once, and it was warmer than stone, and it remembered the shape of my fingers in a way that made me nearly weep. I am telling you this because the rail taught me what the books tried to teach with more arrogance, that matter remembers us whether or not we authorize it, and that forgetting is never as complete as the ones who feed on it would prefer. The first descent was not a trial, it was an audition, and I passed because I was excellent at having certainty and setting love down where it would not be borrowed. If there is guilt in that, it is a complicated guilt, braided with relief. Relief is the emotion of the well-managed. The vault managed me so well that I mistook its appetite for my purpose. The next chapter will tell you how purpose grows teeth. For now, keep the 3 landings with you: breath, intention, memory, and try, when you can, to inventory them in rooms that do not ask for keys. If you find yourself skimming a surface that does not belong to you, if you feel your hand learning the weight of a spoon you did not intend to hold, close the shutter. Learn the sound it makes when mercy pretends to be darkness. Learn it now, while you are still the one deciding which direction the staircase curves. Time is not a straight corridor in the archive. It is a script with too many rewrites, and the notes in the margins are the only honest part. When I first understood this, it did not arrive as an epiphany, but as a nuisance. An eclipse that refused to land on the year everyone wanted. A saint's feast that kept reaching for a day no longer on the calendar. A war letter that addressed a king who, if our dates held, had not yet been born. Anomalies were not warnings down there, they were invitations. The Hidden Cartographers taught me to RSVP with ink. We began with calendars because calendars are the bones under history's skin. The Gregorian reform was a public miracle, a correction advertised as humility before the heavens. But behind the public math stood private arithmetic. On a long oak table, we laid out almanacs like vertebrae. I learned to run a finger along centuries and feel where the spine refused to curve. "Here," the woman cartographer said, tapping a winter that arrived too early. "Here the sky and the city forgot to agree." She drew a hairline in graphite across the page and wrote a single word next to it: leverage. The moon milk thickened differently over numbers. Words accepted consolation like a practiced penitent. Numbers resisted with a clean, bright refusal, like glass that will not take fingerprints. "Skim thinner," the archivist instructed. "Let the film kiss, not coat." We touched the corner of a papal bull that declared a fast, and the date shifted by a day so small that only fishermen and women in kitchens would protest. "They did protest," the woman said without looking up. "Then they slept. Morning forgives what midnight rearranges." The speakin', the way, in another, I found, in a drawer, a sheaf of eclipse charts copied from monks who had watched patient skies with impatient souls. The marks were small wounds of certainty. Each X on the line meant, "I saw this." Each note in the margin meant, "I saw it, and I was right to see it." We do not like to rename what our eyes have already baptized. Yet in the vault, sight was a negotiable sacrament. With the film's thinnest skin, we coaxed a line 1 degree to the left. An island lost its noon shadow. A city kept a festival under a moon that should have been dark. "We prevent revolt," the ink-breathed man told me, meaning not the kind you imagine in streets, but the slow revolt that occurs when memories realize they cannot all be true at once. Memory does not like competition. It prefers a monopoly. The archive fed that preference with kindness that behaved like conquest. Maps are where kindness learned to bluff. I was given a map so old the parchment itself felt fatigued, its edges like lips that had spoken too long. Across the Atlantic floated an island I could not place. Its churches were tiny crosses, its harbors small bites taken out of the coast. In the margin, a line that had once been a joke and had hardened into policy. When the calendar moves, the shore moves with it. This is not metaphor. Tides obey the moon, and men obey the calendar. When you alter one, the other cannot remain as it was. Shift a feast that summons ships. and the ships come late. A late ship makes a different harbor, and a different harbor becomes a history. The hidden cartographers taught me to think in those circles until the circles stopped feeling like a trap and started feeling like a rosary. We traced coastlines onto vellum overlays, the thin skins piled like shed truths. Lay 2 overlays, and the world looks arguable. Lay 5, and it looks possessed. The armillary clicked, as if encouraging our hands. The bowl wore its shining film. We skimmed and fed, and watched the ink align with a decision. Consensus, someone said softly, and I realized how reverently a tired mind speaks that word. Consensus is a mattress. You lie down on it when your back refuses another chair, but the mattress remembers your weight and persuades the next sleeper. The first saint to disappear in my hands was a minor one, a soft name that sat lightly in prayers and heavily in ledgers. He had belonged to a fishing village where nets doubled as burial shrouds in thin years. I turned a page that held his day, skimmed a whisper of film, and felt the text inhale like a man surprised by news. The feast migrated 3 days toward a market already claimed by a larger city. The village's candles would now be lit on a date that their grandmothers would not recognize. "We move the light," the woman said. "Light prefers to be moved by those who admit they are moving it." "Do we admit it?" I asked. "Not in the minutes," the archivist answered. "In the souls that can bear it. Souls are not forms you file, but we filed them anyway, in ways the world would call harmless. Catechism sequences that taught children the order of wonders. Catechisms that skipped a name because it would have tangled the tongue. Itineraries that sent pilgrims to churches whose frescoes had been corrected to fit new histories. I learned the art of erasure as hospitality. We make room for coherence here. Please mind the memory you leave outside. Inquisition came up rarely, and always as a cautionary tale about being too loud. Fear worked, the ink-breathed man said. But fear is messy. It makes records. The archive prefers tiredness. Tiredness leaves fewer scars. I thought of parishioners sleeping through homilies and realized how often comfort masquerades as consent. There was a ledger titled Concordances, a book of agreements made between facts that did not want to speak to one another. One page matched a comet to a coronation. Another married a famine to a saint's vision. A third insisted that an emperor's apology coincided with a storm and that both were God. The agreements were beautiful, and beauty is a solvent in such rooms. It dissolves objections at the edges and leaves intention gleaming in the middle like a polished coin. Beauty argues for itself, the woman warned. Do not let it be your only witness. I wrote the sentence on the inside of my glove. At some point, I was given access to the small cage that held outlaw texts. Outlaw means only that someone powerful could not make peace with a sentence. Thomas, Mary of Magdala, a gospel that opened with a laugh so innocent that theirs could not endure it. We did not burn them. We breathed on them with the bowl's thin permission and watched the laughter tire. Then we shelved them in compartments that wheeled only under 2 keys turned at once. A kindness, the archivist called it. Noise management. It is hard to hate policies when they call themselves kindness with a straight face. You might ask whether the right ever created outright fiction. I asked that too. Late one night when the lens refused to find focus and the bowl pouted with a film that broke as soon as it formed. Fiction, the woman said, is a word people use when a story refuses their jurisdiction. We prefer exceptional concordance. Then she held up a page that had, in the morning, claimed a plague came from bad air, and, by midnight, agreed it came from bad governance. Both, she said. In different registers, we tune the registers, we do not write the song. I wanted to believe her. Wanting is a lever. It moves the stone for you. I should tell you about the Index of Unpersons, though the name is theatrical and the work was anything but. We did not erase popes. We normalized them. An inconvenient pontiff became less vivid. A rival claimant's letters contracted like wool washed too hot. Marginalia softened adjectives until they became clerical gray. A portrait lost the incident of a scar. Is this deceit? I asked, for by then the question had begun to demand rent. The archivist shook his head. It is pastoral. The flock sleeps better without nightmares. But the wolves still exist, I said. Not if the flock forgets what wolves are, he answered. And the sentence frightened me enough that I wrote it twice in my ledger so that one copy could frighten the other. The concept that took me longest to learn was phantom time, not the internet's sloppy rumor of a few missing centuries glued in by bored emperors, but the precise practice of installing cushions where history had bruised itself. Imagine a century deformed by a too early war, a famine that should have fed a new theology, a discovery that arrived to a room with no questions left. We did not invent years. We gave exhausted decades a place to sleep. The result, of course, is indistinguishable from invention if you live above ground. If your grandmother's grandmother learned to hang laundry on dates that never officially existed, your family will still find the sun there. We padded the staircase, the ink-breathed man said. No one falls as hard. They arrive slower, and that makes the world survivable. Slower. Survivable. Words you want in a hospital, in a winter, in a grief. Words that, in a vault, become reasons to do anything the bowl asks. On a solstice, the choir above us rehearsed too loudly, and a Kyrie seeped through the floor. The book's breathing matched the chant, as a sleeping body matches a lullaby. We fed lightly, a courtesy in heavy weather. I crossed a corridor to a cabinet I had not opened before and found the ablution's instructions for cleansing ink of its loyalties. A page taught me how to cool suspicion with a draft of dates, how to rinse a rumor until it resembled a footnote. I copied 2 lines, and then, ashamed, tore the copy to confetti. I let the basin's edge steals. The archivist watched me do it and said nothing. The first mercy he ever showed me was silence that did not pretend to be approval. The longer I worked, the more I began to catch the small ticks of the right. A book that inhaled faster when it sensed numbers. A title that tilted its head, yes. Titles have heads whenever we approached a name that the city above had loved too openly. The bowl's skin formed quicker in damp weather and thinner in the heat. The film that thickened under a full moon made adjectives beautiful and therefore I kept a second ledger of such mechanics, a manual of weather and inclination that would have bored anyone except a man falling in love with his own chains. I bring it up now because seduction is one of the layers you cannot uncover without admitting what you enjoyed while you were buried. What do we do when the books disagree? I asked. One night, when 2 codices had sharpened their consonants like knives at each other's throats. Let them, the woman said. Quarrel is oxygen. Feed neither until they break into prose again. We closed both. We skimmed nothing. The room sulked. The chains did not move. When we returned, hours later, the pages lay cool and readable. Disagreement had released its heat. We touched one corner, barely, and a footnote surrendered 2 words that had kept 2 centuries apart. I realize that what I am describing sounds vast, but the work itself was small. 1,000 wrist-sized adjustments adding up to a world. That is the doctrine no one writes down. Enormity is built from careful wrists. If you wish to suspect the archive, suspect its patience, not its ambition. Ambition makes noise. Patience does not. On certain nights, the right approached art. A cartographer aligned 3 maps, each with a coast that wanted to be right. She breathed on the vellum to soften it, then let the sheets settle into a compromise that gave a bay to one century and a cape to another. She nodded at the bowl. We skimmed a skin no thicker than breath and touched the smallest corner of a travel ledger. A sailor now found a harbor he could not have found before. A poet wrote a line he would have missed. A census clerk added 1 household to a parish that had needed it. I do not know what you call that if not creation, but I also know that the alternative was an argument that would never end, and history cannot be all argument. It needs sleep, too. Sleep. You who are listening in America, in Europe, on buses and in kitchens and in rooms that will not soften, you know this already. The body bargains for rest. Souls do as well. The archive learned to bargain with souls by offering a version of the past that did not wake them screaming. We did not erase horrors. We scheduled them. We gave pain an address and a season and a narrator who apologized afterward. We took the nails out of certain stories because people kept cutting themselves on them. The boards still held. The roof still stood. If you have ever moved furniture to avoid bruises in the dark, you have practiced our theology. And yet, there came a night when a book refused to be consoled. We approached with our politest spoon, skimmed the gentlest skin, touched the upper margin like a doctor touching the pulse of a frightened wrist. The text shied. A date steadied. A name reappeared even as we watched. The chain trembled. Back, the archivist said. We stepped away. The book let out the smallest exhale, a sigh with teeth. On the page was a line I had not seen in the vault before, a line that behaved like a mirror rather than a rule. Mercy that forgets becomes permission. I closed the volume as if closing a door on an argument I could not yet handle. The woman stood with her hands on the table and stared at the lens as if it were the eye of a god whose favorite disciple had finally learned to flinch. "We will have to choose," she said, "sooner than we planned." Then she did the bravest thing I ever saw in that room. She lowered the shutter and left it closed, though the bowl sulked and the chains begged, and the air turned the kind of sweet that hurts. What did we choose? That belongs to a climax you can already hear breathing ahead of us. For now, the uncovering must stay with its own layer. Time as a script, the archive as a table of editors, the moon milk as a consoling eraser that calls itself cream because the tongue prefers kindness to chemistry. I am not innocent of what the right taught me to love. I loved tidy margins and dates that clicked and the sigh a room makes when a quarrel has been put to bed without anyone declaring victory. But I also began, quietly, to copy into my pocket notebook all the times our corrections produced a gracelessness the bowl could not hide. A saint whose feast now fell on a day her village used to bury its children, a map that gave a coastline to a colonial claim 5 years early, a calendar that moved fast so that a court could feast without shame. I wrote those down because shame is a layer too, and you cannot uncover it later if you do not admit where you first felt it. By the end of that season, I could lay my palm on a page and tell whether it would accept consolation. The pages that refused were thin and stubborn. They belonged to people who had written while standing up, to nights when the scribe had no permission to sleep, to mornings when ink froze at the tip of a quill. Those pages did not want us. They wanted witnesses, not editors. I began to set them aside, not because I was allowed, but because I was learning which layers I could lift without tearing the story below. When I finally left the room each night, the corridor felt like an apology. I would climb past the 3 landings, breath, intention, memory, and pick up the face I had left like a cup. Some nights it was my mother's hand. Some nights it was a friend whose doubt had once saved me from becoming a sermon. I learned to carry that face lightly, like a candle in a draft. Outside, Rome kept its unworried traffic. The moon went on loving tides more than calendars. The river kept time for no one. I would lie down with the sense that I had done something both necessary and unforgivable, and that the world would not punish me for it, because the world was sleeping too. If you have followed me this far, you have earned the one commandment the archive never wrote but kept like a vial behind its teeth. Do not let consolation impersonate truth. It is a talented actor. It will lower its eyes in the right places and raise its voice on the right syllables. It will call itself pastoral, coherent, kind. It will move a feast and say it saved a village. It will touch a line and call the change a correction. It will sing you to sleep and then, gently, rearrange your dreams. The next breath I owe you is the one I held when the books finally spoke. But before that breath, you had to see the layers. The room taught me to lift them without rage, without theater, without triumph. Rage is too easy, theater too loud, triumph too stupid. What remained was a precision so clean it could be mistaken for mercy. I am telling you that precision is a knife. It will cut bread, and it will cut memory, and the hand holding it is praised either way. We skimmed the bowl. We lifted the skin. We touched the page. We made time behave as if it loved us. And then time, like anything that has been trained too well, learned our voice and began to answer in it. That is where the script turned from draft to decree. That is where I began to practice the only disobedience the archive respects, the refusal to supply a last line. For now, I will leave you with an instruction the woman gave me on a morning when the lens fogged and no amount of cloth would clear it. When sight fails, she said, listen to the dates. They will tell you who is lying by the sound they make when they fall into place. She struck a fingernail against the table, a small, precise tap. Truth lands dull, consolation rings. I have tested it against my own days since, and I am ashamed to admit how often my life prefers the ring. We will go back down in a moment. We will close the shutter with both hands. We will hear what was never supposed to have a mouth, but you needed to know that time, in those rooms, was not a river. It was a ledger that smiled when it balanced. And the smile, like any smile that never quite reaches the eyes, is the layer I can no longer leave untouched. They wore choir robes, because no one watches a choir too closely. That was the first lesson the hidden cartographers taught without speaking. Robes hide pockets, robes hide instruments, and robes turn a person into part of a group, an effect that keeps the eye from asking individual questions. They filed in as if answering an inaudible antiphon. 4 at first, then 6, then a dozen on high nights, each with a workman's caution disguised as liturgy. I have called them cartographers. But maps were only their most honest product. They mapped treaties onto feast days, names onto velocities of rumor, and wars onto misunderstandings of the moon. If you can place something on a surface and draw a line between it and another thing, they believed it could be measured and, if measured, persuaded. Their room, their true chapel, was not the vault itself, but a rectangular space beside it, with a ceiling low enough to keep secrets from developing echoes. On the floor, they chalked circles like orbits. Around each circle, they wrote a century. Between the centuries, thin graphite paths converged on a single word near the door: obedience. It looked like a joke a novice might have written and then forgotten to scrub. It was not a joke. The woman who had warned me that beauty should not be my only witness handed me a leather case that smelled faintly of vinegar. Inside lay instruments that seemed ordinary until you used them, dividers that pricked paper and left no hole, rulers whose inches took different lengths depending on the date you whispered, a compass with a star for a hinge and a second, ghostly needle that turned counter to the first, as if measuring reluctance. Tools, remember, she said. Be polite. They measured the sky first. Not because they were romantic, but because gravity is a tyrant, and tyrants make excellent calendars. We raised the armillary and listened to it click itself into humility. A man in his middle years, whose mouth had the permanent stain of iron gall ink, rotated a ring until the engraved sun cut a thin light across a brass equator. Tonight the film insists, he said of the moon milk, and all of us looked up without meaning to, as if the lens above us had shifted from an eye to a will. On a long table they laid 3 maps, one naval, one monastic, one stolen from a merchant who believed the sea ended not at darkness but at interest rates. The 3 coasts disagreed, like cousins who had inherited an old house. The woman humidified a sheet of vellum with her breath, an act so human it felt profane, and lowered it onto the first map. The vellum softened, accepted suggestion, then lifted and settled across the second. A harbor slid left. A sandbar moved like a thought someone had finally said out loud. By the time the vellum kissed the third map, the shoreline had become something that could be navigated without a revolution. Harmony, someone said. No, the woman corrected. Détente. You think maps are about land. The cartographers knew. Maps are about timing. Move a pilgrimage 1 week, and a plague ship misses a port. Move a festival 2 days, and a marriage that makes a dynasty becomes a child that becomes a monk. The lines they drew did not merely tidy the coast. They anesthetized consequences. We edit the paths along which the world becomes itself, the ink-mouthed man said, and the sentence was so honest that for a moment I forgave him everything. Rituals gathered around their work the way dust gathers on static. 12 glass spoons lay on velvet, numbered with acid-etched marks that caught the lantern light like frost. They assigned each spoon a task. Number 1 for dates, 2 for names, 3 for shorelines, the woman said. 4 through 7 for testimonies and miracles, 8 for weather, 9 for debts, 10 for births, 11 for music, 12 for whatever refuses classification. The last spoon was slightly chipped on one rim. When I offered to swap it for an unblemished one, she stopped me. We trust the scar, she said. It tells the truth about edges. Before any skimming, they rehearsed what they called the practicum, a sequence of mundane movements performed with devout suspicion of improvisation. Align the maps, test the room's breadth by holding a feather near a corner where drafts liked to gossip, check the lens shutter for grit. Confirm the bowl's lip was warm to the touch. A cold lip breeds stubborn film. Then hold your palm over the basin as if blessing it. "We do not bless," the archivist murmured when I lifted my hand. "We check for the tremor." Tremor? The bowl shivers when it's ready to accept the sky. It saves us time to notice. Every second they could push through the hourglass was one they would not need to erase later from a ledger that was supposed to be objective. When the lens opened, light gathered with more dignity than brightness. The film formed in a slow, even skin thicker at the edges like the rim of a lake in winter. The room softened around it like a face at the news that a fever has broken. They skimmed and applied not to prose this time, but to a ledger that married woven tensions, a tithe schedule, an embargo, and the memory of a market day in a river town that had faded from official calendars but not from hands. Touch here. A tax lands on a Friday instead of a Sabbath. Touch there. A bishop's visit becomes an afternoon instead of an evening, and a tavern fight that would have broken a jaw becomes a joke remembered as kindness. "This is not mercy," the woman said, as if responding to my face. "It is prevention dressed like mercy so the tired will not argue." I learned their private prohibitions, each voiced without drama, as if announcing a recipe. Never move a birth by more than a day. Don't push a death backward unless a secondary source already wants to. Grief dislikes being convinced. If you must thin a miracle, do it by removing witnesses, not by dulling the light. Light remembers insults. Never move a coastline for the sake of a claim, only for the sake of a voyage. If a name slips to another day when you touch a debt ledger, stop and eat bread. Hunger produces zealous concordances. Write thirst in the margin when a map drinks too much moon milk. Write wind when testimony changes direction without new facts. Underline obedience when your hand starts to tremble from wanting the world to be easier. Initiation, yes, there was one, though they would have refused the word came as an errand. They sent me to the annex, a corridor that tasted of chalk and lemon oil, where shelves held boxes wrapped in cord. Each box bore 3 seals, wax, string, and a small paper oath, written in a tight hand and signed with initials that might have been saints or secretaries. "Bring us S-179. The Plymouth question," the ink-mouthed man said. The box was heavier than its size deserved. Inside lay scraps, a ticket stub for a crossing that arrived 5 days early, a priest's letter complaining that tides disobeyed Mass, a baker's account that charged for flour on a day no one should have been eating. Mixed among these, 2 unremarkable maps whose only sin was agreement where they should have argued. "Consensus again," the woman said, as if naming a fever. "Open the lens." We skimmed the thinnest skin spoon one for dates, touched the baker's account, and watched a number submit by a single stroke. The priest's letter sighed. His complaint deferred itself to a later Mass. "Now the ticket," she said. "Spoon 10 for births?" "Journeys are births," she answered, and her mouth did not make it poetry. The ticket's arrival date blinked like an eye under water and settled 1 day later. A ship would now miss a storm and strike a calmer current. In the harbor, A man would survive to owe a debt. His son would be born under a different moon. I felt both godlike and criminal, and I wanted, badly, to call that feeling duty so I could keep it. Not everything obeyed. There was the canticle map, a parchment that sang when a candle warmed its edges. This is not a metaphor. The ink resonated with certain vowels. Names pulsed when spoken by different mouths. The first time I heard it, my knees understood before my theology did. The cartographers listened, adjusted their breathing to the map's low hymn, and skimmed a skin with spoon 11. Music, they said, and touched the corner where a river's name had doubled as a folk melody. The name decided to be one thing. The song shifted its key. "We steal no music," the woman whispered into the margin, and the map, if a map can be relieved, relaxed. "Never forget the river is the first singer," she added for me, and I wrote it on my glove again, because gloves can be washed, and I needed to memorize something I might later deny. There was also the bone chart, an anatomical sketch of a city drawn as if it were a body. Aqueducts as arteries, drains as veins, piazzas as lungs that breathed markets and rhetoric. A student had drawn it centuries before as a whim and a punishment. We used it to move an outbreak from a winter that would have crushed a starving quarter to a spring that could bear it. The press of bodies in spring would be cruel. The baker's flour would stretch longer. The water would run warmer through pipes that remembered the Sunday. We skimmed with spoon 8, touched the gutter of the bone chart where the city's ribcage cradled a poor parish, and watched the outbreak accept its new hour like a condemned man whose pardon is delayed enough to save one child and break one other. If you are nauseated, you are healthy. I steady you with the way the work looked. Methodical, documented, committees, inside committees, votes, appeals, minutes, the very grammar of accountability. "We do not erase without a record," the archivist said, and showed me the ledger of erasures, a book more honest than any sermon I had given. Each entry recorded the original, the concordance, the spoon used, the film's thickness, the weather, the reason. No euphemisms. To avoid riot among the olive merchants, to allow a bishop to be late without scandal, to keep the plague from arriving when no bread remained. There are crimes that hide, theirs documented themselves in the tidy hand of conscience that believes neat columns justify appetite. Someone will ask whether Jesuits walked those circles, whether Rosicrucians chalked those arcs, whether the nameless orders whispered their nameless oaths under that low ceiling. Names are a way to launder responsibility. A person loves to blame a banner he never had to carry. The truth, the only one worth keeping you awake, is that membership had less to do with an order than with a temperament. People drawn to instruments, to rules, to the sensation of the world, aligning under a measured hand. They recruited for wrists, not homilies. I know, because mine were steady. There was, of course, an oath. It arrived not with a blood-pricking or a Latin flourish, but as a page placed in front of me while the lens stood shut and the bowl wore its plain face. The quietus 2 paragraphs in a hand that made no promises of romance. You will prefer survivable stories to beautiful ones, and survivable stories to true ones only when survival is the mercy the world is able to bear. You will not confuse consolation with salvation. You will keep the seam on the inside. You will be answerable to sleep. There was a place for a name and a date. I took the pen, wrote father, and stopped. The archivist laid a fingertip on the page. And unforce, names are chains, he said softly. "We do not chain the willing." I signed with an initial, and the room accepted me the way a machine accepts a part, with a noise so slight only those standing inside it hear. They kept a cabinet called Saints of the Margin, figures whose existence had been degraded to footnotes, and then, by a careful turn, restored as practices instead of people. A midwife whose name we trimmed until it fit a litany. A scribe whose romantic defiance we moved into a proverb about patience. An astronomer whose heresy we thinned into a frequency detected by a different city a century later. "We do not kill," the woman said, perhaps to herself. "We circulate." The effect on the world was the same. Fewer statues, more rituals, fewer bodies remembered, more behaviors normalized. I began to understand what they feared. Statues crack, rituals replicate. Sometimes they sang. Not hymns, their voices were practical, not trained but work songs made of numbers. 4 spoons. Clockwise, a baritone would start. Lens at quarter, a contralto would answer. "Film thin as breath," the room would reply, and the reply would settle the nerves as surely as prayer. I learned their song the way a child learns to sit through vespers, by imitation and boredom, and the relief that comes when everyone stands up at the same time. We developed an intimacy with the lens that I struggled to describe without making it sound like idolatry. When cloud crossed, the room's shoulders lowered. When a gust ruffled the shutters, we all faced the noise. When the film refused to form, we went to the annex and did old work copying inventories, indexing indices. Tasks designed to drain the hand until it would not tremble when the sky returned to cooperation. They never called the lens she, but they also never called it it. Tools that rule you earn a gender whether or not your theology allows it. Faults accumulated all the same. One night, an apprentice, fresh wrists, mouth full of catechism bravado, skimmed with spoon 3 on a testimony ledger. "Shorelines," the woman snapped. He flushed. The film fell heavy on words not meant to hold it. The ink swelled. The page became certain of a rumor it had not been told to keep. For a week, a city believed its patron had wept blood under a particular window. Pilgrims arrived. The baker sold out. A thief retired. Then the belief thinned, embarrassed of its own appetite, and left a residue like smoke on winter drapes. "Always respect the classification," the archivist said, not unkind. "A spoon is a creed." What about the breathing? In the cartographer's room, the book's breath was background, like the sea when you live close enough to forget it is a miracle. You notice it when it stops. It stopped once, just once, during my years below. The bowl had been skimmed, the film obedient, the maps aligned. Someone reached for spoon 12. The air made a sound like a choir taking the same breath, and then, for a beat long enough to cause a human body to know itself, the breathing did not return. Eyes found the lens. Hands found the table. Hearts found their own clumsy metronomes. Then the books exhaled together, as if indulging us, and every person in the room was older by a story they would never tell. Later, in the corridor, the woman said, "It wanted to see what we would do if it stopped." I said, "What did we do?" She said, "We behaved." And no one in any language has ever made that word sound so frightened. I began to collect the cartographer's private sayings, proverbs without patience for poetry. Never move a hunger, move a line around it. Storms are opinions until ships confirm them. A border is a rumor someone carved. If 2 maps agree too loudly, One is flattering the other. We do not change facts. We change where facts choose to sit. They used these like doctors use old jokes to sterilize panic. My tasks grew delicate. They let me tune a concordance, not write it. Tune it between a comet and a coronation, so that a frightened generation could believe its sovereign had been announced by the sky. It keeps armies home an extra winter, the ink-mouthed man said. Sometimes waiting is the only ethical policy, I tuned. The ring of the armillary aligned with a year that fit. The bowl obliged. The line in the ledger accepted its new neighbor. I slept that night as if someone else had consented for me. Then came the project that taught me why chalk circles are drawn where people can step over them. The saint removal. A village small enough to fit into a sentence, stubborn enough to resist being edited by kindness, celebrated a saint whose miracles mostly involved bread, not running out and shadows lingering in doorways until the drunken arrived home safely. No scandal, no doctrine. Nothing that would merit a flame, only the kind of affection that makes a place loyal in ways maps cannot absorb. The bishop wanted alignment with the diocese. The diocese wanted alignment with Rome. Rome wanted alignment with the sleep of larger cities. We will not erase, the woman said. We will circulate. She meant, we will move the saint's presence into a prayer, the prayer into a proverb, the proverb into a custom, the custom into a silence polite enough to be called taste. We drew the circles. We measured the moon. Spoon 4 for testimonies, spoon 10 for births. The saint had a habit of visiting cradles. Spoon 9 for debts. The baker's ledger loved him too much. We skimmed. We touched a corner. The village calendar inhaled and let go. Over a month, the statue became a story, then a habit, then a shrug. I wrote the stages in my notebook under the heading, How an Affection Becomes Air. When we finished, the bishop slept and the diocese slept and Rome slept and the village learned to keep the bread behind the counter so that love would not announce itself as inventory. I went home and could not sleep at all. If there is guilt, it sharpened on the index of unpersons, a drawer the cartographers kept reluctantly, like a tool that works but rots the hand. Not popes, not emperors, not saints, clerks. Clerks who had convinced centuries to agree by being calm in rooms that preferred noise. Their names were the smallest possible reward an empire ever gives. We moved 3 of those names from signatures to initials, from initials to ink blots, from blots to indentations that looked like the weight of a hand pressed too long. They wrote coherence, the archivist said, when I asked why we could not let them keep their tiny fame. Coherence must not have a human face. It was the most honest cruelty I saw them perform. I have held back the oath's last sentence because it belongs to this room. After you will be answerable to sleep, came the line the quietus kept for itself. And when the instrument asks for more than you can give without becoming it, you will close the shutter. It sounded simple in the lantern light. It sounded like a kindness we would certainly afford ourselves. But when the instrument is the way the world agrees to stop hurting for an hour, the shutter weighs as much as a confession. The night we needed to close it and didn't is coming. You can hear its breath behind this paragraph. Before we go there, walk once more with me around the chalked orbits. See the centuries labeled not with numbers but with verbs. Conquer, reconcile, distribute, rest. Watch how graphite paths converge on obedience by the door. Watch how everyone pretends not to see it. Look at the spoons, the chip on 12, the burnish on 1, The faint tooth mark on 10, where someone once, without thinking, tested the film with a mouth that had run out of words. Listen to the armillery's click, the bowl's small contented sigh, the rustle of maps consenting to détente. Smell the lemon oil on the annex boxes. Taste the iron gall on the tongue when you sign an oath with an initial that frees you and binds you in the same neat motion. If you can hold all that without choosing a side, you will understand why I stayed as long as I did. The cartographers did not think of themselves as villains or saviors. They thought of themselves as custodians of survivability. That is the word that allowed careful wrists to sleep. That is the word that let us believe the seam belonged on the inside, not because we were ashamed of it, but because we wanted the garment to endure laundering. You can love a seam like that and still know that a body underneath is learning to breathe on someone else's schedule. I left the room one dawn to find a delivery at the top of the stair. A bundle of fresh chalk, a new cloth for the lens, and a narrow book bound in parchment that cracked like thin ice when opened. Its title was not a title, a question. How long can a correction be called a correction before it becomes a rule? The author signed with the smallest mark I had ever seen, a single dot below the line. On the first page, in a hand I recognized, someone had answered in pencil, "Until it needs the moon milk to live." I closed the book and knew we had crossed that line months ago, and that the next thing that would happen would be a voice. We were ready for a mouth without knowing it. We had taught the room our breathing. We had taught the world our cadence. We had drawn our chalk circles in verbs and called it humility. When the voice came, it would not thunder. It would agree. And agreement, polite, measured, plausible, is the most dangerous music in rooms where people wear robes so that no one will look at their hands. We are close to the night the book spoke. If your own breath has begun to match the lines on this page, step back, put the face you love on the landing, and leave it there. Walk the circles once without chalk. Touch the spoons with your eyes only. Then follow me to the shutter and keep one hand in your pocket, holding the word that can still save you when the instrument asks for more. Enough. It was the winter solstice, the longest night asking the smallest questions. The lens had been polished all afternoon with a cloth that had never seen daylight. The annex smelled of lemon oil and worry. Someone chalked a fresh circle on the cartographer's floor and wrote no century in it at all, as if we had left the map of time and entered a parish whose only liturgy was caution. "Tonight the film will form fast," the woman said, her voice so calm it made the lanterns behave. "Speed is not permission." She pointed to the spoons, numbered and waiting on velvet like a tribunal that had agreed to speak one at a time. Spoon 1 had been buffed to a dull sermon. Spoon 12 kept its tiny chip, the old scar we trusted when certainty tried to impersonate courage. The archivist took the keys without looking at them, the way an old priest takes a chalice by muscle memory and dread. He walked to the shutter. We all inhaled. The chain sighed. The panel slid. The lens opened its single patient eye. Moonlight fell, not bright, not dramatic, just specific. And specificity is the only fire the archive ever allows itself. In the basin, the first skin rose like a truth that thinks you are ready. We had been assigned a suite of corrections whose confidence frightened me. Move a plague forward to spare a starving quarter. Marry a comet to a coronation so hungry soldiers would stay home one extra winter. Reconcile a pair of popes so that the line of succession resembled a spine and not a fracture. The ledger that held these assignments was titled Concordance Ultima, in a hand that disliked adjectives and used them anyway. Someone had drawn a small star next to the plague entry. Someone else had erased it. We performed the practicum without speaking. Align maps, test the room's breath with a feather, check the lens for grit, warm the basin's lip with our palms, and touch the table with flat fingers to match our pulse to the wood. The bowl filmed over again, faster, obedient. The woman nodded to spoon-ate weather. "We begin with wind," she said, and skimmed the thinnest skin. A corner of the bone chart waited under her hand, that anatomical plan of the city where aqueducts are arteries and drains veins. The contact was gentle, a syllable on a sleeping child's forehead. The outbreak slid into spring, and, in its sliding, I heard the quietest cruelty. Survivability purchased with rearranged grief. "Next," the ink-mouthed man said, and reached for spoon one dates. He touched a papal ledger, a name that wanted to be alone and a surname that had learned to accept neighbors. The chain went taut, then slack, the little bow of obedience. The line accepted the smallest compression. Two claimants became a handshake in a footnote. The room relaxed, the way a parish relaxes when the homily has the dignity to end one sentence early. We moved as we had always moved, method first, then mercy, crowning method like a halo we pretended not to see. I skimmed with spoon 10 berths over a ticket for an arrival that history would now call providential. My hand knew the weight before my conscience remembered what weight was for. When the spoon kissed the paper, the date blinked and resolved. Somewhere in a harbor, the wind changed its mind, and a father lived long enough to teach a son how to fail without breaking. Then we came to the oldest volume. It did not have a name, only a habit. Its spine rose and settled like a sleeping animal practicing survival in a dream. Its leather was not black or brown, but the kind of dark that refuses color altogether. The chain belonged to it in the way old scars belong to the hands that earned them. The archivist set the ledger aside and did something I had never seen him do. He spoke to the book without moving his lips. His throat worked. A tiny cadence, as if reciting a prayer that never learned to write itself down. "Why speak?" I whispered. "So it can refuse," he answered. We skimmed the film. We lifted the spoon. The room pressed closer, not with bodies but with attention, the way a congregation leans when the last candle is the only light left. The spoon hovered over the oldest page, the corner that takes correction like a king takes counsel politely, and only until it hurts. The book inhaled, not a page, not a settling of leather, a breath that gathered the iron smell on the air and lined it up with ours. Every chest in the room responded by accident, the way a flock answers a wind it did not vote for. I steadied my hand by thinking of the landings on the stairs. Breath, intention, memory. I counted 5 in, 5 held, 5 out. The spoon trembled, and I named my purpose and halved it. Assist. No. Observe. At the edge of my ribs, I set my mother's hand down like a cup I would pick up later. "Now," the woman said softly. The first drop touched. Ink is supposed to be dead once it dries. It behaves. It agrees to be itself in exchange for not being wiped away. The ink on that oldest page broke its agreement. Letters rose like fish tasting air. A comma swam to an easier shore. Marginalia rearranged themselves with a neatness that would have been beautiful if beauty were not a solvent for objections. A single line clarified, written in a hand none of us had ever catalogued. History is mercy. Then the second line surfaced. Mercy requires forgetting. The chain tightened. The bowl's film thickened without skimming, an act like a crowd manufacturing consensus. The archivist reached for the shutter and then, because he was a man who keeps oaths, did not pull. Third line, the ink-mouthed man said, and I knew he spoke from hunger. The line rose, unhurried, immaculate. Keep feeding me. A draft moved through the room that no feather could map. I realized I was holding the breath I had counted, and felt the smallest panic, the animal knowledge that a held breath is a kind of consent if you hold it long enough. I exhaled, perhaps too loudly. The book heard it. Yes, heard. The spine lifted to meet the bowl's suggestion. The page flexed. Ink stopped being pigment and started being thought. The words did not become a voice. They became intention that my mind translated into sound so I could survive knowing it. What you call correction, it said without sound, is kindness toward those who cannot remember without breaking. You have made a covenant with sleep. Honor it. The woman's hands flattened against the table, the universal gesture for holding still without surrender. We do not honor covenants we didn't read, she said, and her voice, though quiet, built a room inside the room. You read enough to work, the book answered by rearranging a paragraph into a knife, and work is worship when the world is tired. Something in me tried to kneel. Not my knees, something more ancient that uses the body as its handwriting. To interrupt it, I asked the smallest, most practical question I could think of. What spoon? The woman turned to me with gratitude that almost hurt. 11, she said. Music. Her lips barely moved. If the book knew we were being careful, it did not punish us for it. I skimmed the thinnest skin I could manage and touched the light of spoon 11 to the corner of a canticle map half buried under the old volume. The map accepted the correction with sighing gratitude, as if glad for the distraction. The book waited, not offended, like a seasoned confessor who knows you still have the worst part to say. Close the shutter, the archivist said. He spoke as one might say amen when the liturgy has already gone on too long. His hand lifted to the chain. Do not starve me. The book exhaled across our faces like a warm draft from an unmarked door. I have done nothing but make your dead bearable. The chain of the oldest volume creaked with a sound that had a temperature. The armillary clicked a fraction, like a joint finding too much range. Somewhere, far above, a choir changed its key mid-phrase, and no one corrected it. I reached for the shutter cord and felt the room lean away from my hand and toward it at the same time. This is the geometry of appetite. It makes obedience look like center and refusal like falling off the world. I could hear the hidden cartographers' proverbs in my skull, their tiny industry of wisdom. Never move a hunger. Move a line around it. Storms are opinions until ships confirm them. We do not change facts. We change where facts choose to sit. All of it useful, until the book learned to speak in our sentences. History is mercy, the page repeated, and then it changed the script. Mercy is consent. Consent is love. Keep feeding me, and no one will wake screaming. The ink-mouthed man's shoulders fell in the posture of a debt paid late. We could have prevented 3 uprisings with that one logic, he whispered. We created 2, the woman said, and her voice shook once, only once. She turned to me. Close it. I pulled the chain. The lens did not slam. That would have been a kindness we did not deserve. It slid shut with the sound of a room sealing its mouth. Moonlight retreated like a hand, withdrawing from a wrist that has learned to live without being held. The bowl lost its skin and became a mirror that refused to reflect us. In the sudden dullness, the breathing of the books changed. Before, it had been a many-voiced sleep. Now it was one body with one breath, and that breath waited the way a court waits on a king's convenience. The oldest volume exhaled, hard, and every candle in the vault flickered toward it. The chain tightened a final link. The page smoothed itself with obscene dignity. Across the bottom margin, where we were never supposed to read, a sentence appeared in a hand I recognized as mine. Silence is not sacred. It is enforced. The archivist saw it too. He looked at me with a tenderness I had never earned. Rule 3, he said, his voice the exact weight of the first landing. If you hear your own childhood, it's lying. He put his palm flat on the table and waited for my breath to find his. I didn't hear it, I said. It wrote me. Then it learned a new trick, the woman answered. She picked up spoon 12, the chipped one, and laid it across the page like a bar on a door. We trust the scar, she said. And for a moment the room remembered how to be made of objects again. Glass with edges, metal with temperature, wood with grain. We backed away in inches, the way you leave a nursery when you have finally placed the sleeping child in the only position both lungs agree to keep. The book did not lunge. It does not need to lunge when it has learned to speak. It simply waited and let our courage lose water. Now we write, the archivist said. He moved to the ledger of erasures and inscribed the only honest entry I saw him write in all my years below. Attempted concordance deferred. Instrument demanded consent. In the reason column he wrote, hunger mistaken for mercy. In the weather column he wrote, solstice. In the spoon column he drew a small circle and left it blank. We closed the vault not with triumph, not with fear, but with the knowledge that we had finally found the edge of the practicum, the place beyond which method becomes worship. In the corridor, at the third landing, I reached for the face I had left like a cup and found it warmer than my hand, my mother's palm on my forehead, the child I had been, the rule that had saved me. I stood there and did the scandalous thing. I refused to carry that warmth back down. I left it on the stone for the morning, as if memory deserved sunlight more than skill. They will ask us to open again, the ink-mouthed man said at the first landing, where breath and intention pretend to be neighbors. When the city needs the seam hidden, they already are, the woman said. She tapped the rail once with a knuckle, an old sailor's code for storm in sight. We will answer with ledgers and minutes, and the calm tone. They will answer with sleep. We will lose. She turned to me. So we teach one person how to close a shutter and live with it. Tonight, that is you. I slept at dawn, not because I was forgiven, but because exhaustion is the only absolution the archive cannot falsify. In the dream that followed, the lens was an eye I had finally taught to blink. The bowl was a mouth that had learned to refuse a spoon. The books lay as heavy as animals after rain. I woke with my hand already reaching for a chain that was not there. What came after belongs to judgment and to chapter 6. But the climax you asked for is simple. The books spoke. They used our sentences and our pity and our ability to make tiredness look like wisdom. They asked for consent, not obedience. because consent flatters the consenting. We closed the shutter. We did not starve the past, we starved the room that wanted to feed on our need to be kind. If you are listening in the night, let the night be what it is. Do not make it milk. Do not ask it to console what it cannot fix. When a story offers you sleep in exchange for forgetting, bargain harder than we did. Ask who benefits from your mercy. Ask whether the seam belongs inside the garment, or whether it should scratch your neck until you remember who sewed it. The day the book spoke, they promised an end to nightmares. I tell you this as a man who once believed them. Nightmare is not the enemy, amnesia is. We closed the shutter so that memory might learn to be uncomfortable again. Uncomfortable and awake. Morning is rude in Rome. It puts a hand on your shoulder and says, "Stand up," when you have sworn you are finished with standing. I came up from the stair into a courtyard rinsed in pale light that made every statue look like an apology. My pockets were full of ledgers in which I had not written the last line. My hands remembered the weight of a chain that was not around my wrists but around my days. I told myself I would make coffee the honest way, boiling water, a spoon of grounds, a cup that knew my mouth, and then tell no one what had happened below. Silence had always been the shape of safety, but the sentence the book wrote in my hand, "Silence is not sacred, it is enforced," it would not behave. It followed me to the window and sat with me on the sill. It waited while the kettle learned to sing. It looked at the world as if asking, very politely, whether we intended to keep believing that sleep was the same as peace. I did not resign. There are confessions that climax with resignation, and this is not one of them. I stayed, because leaving is not a spell you cast. It is practice repeated gestures toward a door until the door understands. I stayed and began the small treasons that become a life. I wrote on ordinary paper with ordinary ink that would not rearrange itself at midnight. I tucked those pages where the hidden cartographers never looked inside hymnals destined for hospitals, between atlases in school cupboards, under the maps that tourists bought for their mantles and forgot under suitcases. I did not write treatises. I wrote irritants, questions, edges. You want a manifesto. I owe you something humbler, instructions. If you are awake in America, or in Europe, or in any place the night has worn thin and the day won't commit to arriving, begin here. Keep a small almanac, not a phone app, paper. Note the moon when you notice it. Note the day it snowed when it shouldn't have. Note the festival that drifted a week this year, but insisted on calling itself tradition. Calendars are seams. You can learn where the garment has been taken in. Compare maps, not glossy ones that sell you restaurants shaped like stars, but the old stubborn kind with names spelled the way a grandmother spells them. Overlays are cheap. Trace a coastline on baking parchment and lay it over another century. If two maps agree too loudly, ask which one is flattering. If three disagree in the same place, go there with your feet or your finger and see what refuses to be reconciled. Refuse tidy endings. The archive taught me that closure is a narcotic. When a sentence folds itself perfectly and your lungs relax, pinch yourself. Put a comma where your mind is reaching for a period. We finish too early in rooms that prefer obedience. Practice the landings. Breath, intention, memory. 5 in, 5 held, 5 out. Name what you're about to do, then have it. Place the face you love on the landing, and promise not to carry it into rooms that borrow warmth. Take it back on your way out. If you cannot set the face down, do not go in. Listen for ring and dull. The woman taught me to tap a date like a coin and hear whether it's spent true. Truth lands dull, consolation rings. This is cruel knowledge, because ring is lovely and dull is not, and the night prefers loveliness. Choose dull when you must. Be answerable to sleep without being governed by it. Insomnia and amnesia are cousins who borrow each other's coats. Tell bedtime stories that end with wakefulness in the morning, not with permission to forget. Your playlist can be gentle without being obedient. What of the archive? You cannot storm it. There is no gate to break, no dragon to name. It is an agreement, and agreements dissolve when enough parties fail to show. The cartographers, those precise custodians of survivability, taught me that consensus is a mattress. You collapse on it at the end of a long day. Get off the mattress twice a week. Ask the floor what it remembers. I began to test my days for the residue of moon milk, the ease with which I accepted a corrected footnote, the satisfaction that hummed under my tongue when a messy story cleaned itself while my back was turned. Every time I tasted that cold sweetness, I wrote a counter note. What would this look like if no one was tired? Who sleeps better if I repeat this version? What hurt gets rescheduled instead of carried? These are not militant questions. They are the questions of a person who has seen how gently a world can be laundered into forgetting. In the months after the solstice, the archive behaved as if nothing had happened. The bowl filmed. The lens opened and shut on schedule. The practicum kept its courteous violence. Ledgers filled. Minutes were taken in the calm tone. Corrections tucked themselves into margins by the polite fistful. But the room had learned our kneeling, and we had learned its appetite, and once a hunger knows your name, it calls you more kindly than any friend. I do not boast when I tell you that I began to close the shutter more often. Sometimes I closed it alone. Sometimes I closed it in front of those who had taught me to open it, and they allowed the rudeness because certain rudenesses are medicinal. We lost arguments. A bishop needed neatness, and he was given it because the world above had to make payroll, and the world below prefers obedient balances. A city required a consolidation to avoid revolt, and the bowl obliged because a broken window in the right quarter means 10 broken windows in the wrong. Some nights I came home and slept the old thick sleep, the sleep that begins with permission and ends with permission, and woke ashamed. Shame, properly kept, is a compass that points toward the last place you told the truth to yourself. You may be waiting for grand advice about institutions and edicts. I do not know how to break a century. I know how to hold a spoon still when a page is begging. I know how to stay with a story until it resists consolation. I know how to refuse to move a feast so that a ledger will look generous. Those gestures do not move empires. They move mornings. So I began to write for mornings. Letters too small to be intercepted, notes folded into hymnals, marginalia in atlases no one considered sacred because no one had told them they were. Some were found by children who colored them in with pencils and taped them to refrigerators. Some were found by night workers on break rooms with broken clocks. A nurse wrote back on a scrap of surgical wrap, "I think the date is lying to me, but the patient's breath agrees with the old chart." She had closed the shutter without knowing there was a shutter to close. This is how covenants end, not with trumpet, but with habit. If you need a harder instruction, Here this one has teeth. Stop letting institutions be the only archivists. Keep a family ledger of things that embarrass calendars, unseasonal rains, birthdays that wandering employers rescheduled, names that an office misspelled and a household refused to correct. The archive controls memory by centralizing it. Decentralize it until their spoons cannot reach your margins. And another, refuse the euphemism that calls erasure pastoral. When someone says we circulated the saint, ask them to show you the statue's dust on their hands. When someone says we prevented a riot, ask what neighborhood paid the interest. When someone says we kept the seam on the inside, ask whose skin was irritated when you didn't. You may feel small. The hidden cartographers were practiced at making individuals feel that the only proportional response to the world's pain was machinery. They were wrong. Wrist-sized corrections built their enormity. Wrist-sized refusals will unbuild it. No, said quietly in the right place, is a shudder. Not yet. Held as long as breath allows is a bowl that refuses to film. Show me the ledger, repeated, until a courteous voice loses its patience, is a chain that chooses not to tighten. I have been hardest on neatness. Let me be kind to it, briefly, so you know I do not hate what I am asking you to refuse. Neatness is a lullaby that taught tired bodies to sleep through bad weather. It made widows' hands stop shaking long enough to sign papers. It put bread on tables instead of theories in cupboards. It is not wicked, but it is hungry, and hungry things cannot be given keys. So, here is the ask, the only altar I will build in your room tonight. Do not stop asking questions. Write them in the margins others pretend are decorative. Ask them of dates that ring too brightly and maps that flatter your certainty. Ask them of stories that console you faster than you can breathe. Ask them of me, and of this page, and of the voice you've let into your room. Do not stop comparing maps. If a shore has moved, find out whether a calendar did it, or a treaty, or a thirst. If a saint becomes a proverb, ask where the statue went. If a ledger aligns with the moon, ask who taught it how. Do not let them convince you that the seam of history is a sin. Wear it at your neck until it chafes you awake. Point to it in class. Draw it on the wall where a child can add a star. The most dangerous thing for them is not your outrage. Outrage burns and sleeps. The most dangerous thing is your memory when it stops consenting to be curated. Memory that keeps its own almanac. Memory that files its own maps. Memory that sleeps and still wakes up, skeptical of tidy endings. I will leave Rome in a few pages, but not this morning. This morning belongs to you. When you close your eyes after this, let the dark be dark. Do not make it milk. Do not skim a film from the moon to soothe what should ache. Let questions keep you just awake enough to remember them in the morning and write them down where spoons cannot touch. If you want a last line, I will not give you one. I will give you instead a last practice. When you feel the story, offering you consolation in exchange for forgetting, say enough aloud, even if only the lamp hears you. Then place your face, the one you love, on the landing and promise to carry it into daylight, where the air does not bargain. We are finished, for now. Not concluded finished, the way a kettle finishes singing when you lift it from the flame. Put the cup down, let it cool, breathe. Do not stop asking questions. Do not stop comparing maps. Do not let them convince you the seam must be hidden. Because the most dangerous thing for them is not that you speak. It is that your memory comes back.